Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. Alright, let's talk about something that's not just ancient, but primordial. Something that might still be whispering through the warp itself. If you've ever wondered why the warp is such a volatile, chaotic nightmare, and why it's been that way for so long, there's one name that always echoes through the theories: the War in Heaven. Not just some forgotten myth or dusty relic in a xenologist's archive, but possibly the origin point of all the madness we now associate with the immaterium. This isn't just history, it's cosmic trauma. We're talking about a war so old it predates humanity by millions of years, and so massive that its aftershocks might still be warping reality itself. The idea that psychic scars from that war could still be etched into the very fabric of the warp, that's something fans have speculated about for decades. And honestly, the more you dig, the more it starts to feel less like a theory and more like a terrifying truth no one really wants to face. Because if that ancient war still echoes, it means the warp never healed. And if it never healed, maybe it never will. To really understand why the War in Heaven still haunts the warp, you've got to go all the way back to the first great tragedy of the galaxy. We're talking about a time so ancient, so far removed from the present, now that it feels more like myth than history. But in Warhammer, myths tend to have teeth. And this one? It's practically a biting, screaming wound on the face of reality. It all starts with the Necrontyr, a cursed people, born under a dying sun, their entire civilization marked by despair from the beginning. Their lifespans were cruelly short, their bodies frail, and their spirits full of bitterness. Imagine building a culture where every achievement is overshadowed by the knowledge that you'll die far too soon, and painfully at that. That's the core of the Necrontyr's psyche, a deep, gnawing resentment of the universe itself. Then there were the Old Ones, ancient, powerful, and, depending on who you ask, either saviors or manipulators on a cosmic scale. They were masters of the warp, of life itself, crafting species, seeding worlds, and walking across space as if it were a backyard garden. Where the Necrontyr struggled and suffered, the Old Ones thrived and created. It's no wonder the Necrontyr came to despise them. But the rivalry wasn't just political or territorial. It was philosophical. The Necrontyr, grounded in the material world and burdened by their mortality, viewed the Old Ones' manipulation of psychic energy as a kind of cheating, a flaunting of their superiority. And that bitterness? It festered into hatred. Some fans even describe it as the ultimate cosmic inferiority complex. The Necrontyr didn't just want to match the Old Ones. They wanted to erase them. And here's where things get messy, because we're not just talking about a war of ideology. The Necrontyr, desperate to escape their fragile bodies and short lives, made a devil's bargain with the Khitan, the star gods. These entities, if you can even call them that, were consciousnesses formed from the very heart of stars. Massive, inhuman, hungry. The Necrontyr gave themselves over, let their bodies be stripped of flesh and soul, and were reborn as the Necrons. Immortal machines, but at a horrific cost. This transformation wasn't just physical, it broke something deeper. The Necrons lost their souls in the process, sacrificed on the altar of power and survival. And the Khitan? They feasted on the souls of their creators, gaining strength unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. That's when the real war began. The War in Heaven wasn't just a conflict between two species. It was a collision between two visions of reality, one built on mastery of the psychic realm, the other on cold, brutal materialism. The Old Ones wielded the warp like an artist uses a brush. The Necrons, under the control of the Khitan, sought to destroy it, to crush the intangible with raw, burning force. But here's the thing that haunts fans to this day. The psychic energy unleashed during this war was off the charts. We're not talking about a few psychers screaming into the void. We're talking about entire species being created and thrown into battle, whole worlds blinking out under waves of psychic force, warp storms surging and twisting in reaction to the emotional and spiritual carnage. Some believe this was the moment the warp began to curdle, when pain and hate first truly took root in that dimension. There's this idea in the lore, one that a lot of us keep coming back to, that the warp before the War in Heaven was calmer. Not peaceful, maybe, but navigable. A sea of potential rather than a maelstrom of madness. And it was the scale of death, the unimaginable grief and rage of that ancient conflict that permanently distorted it, like screaming into a cave so hard and so long that the echo never dies. This is why so many theories point to the war in heaven as the original sin of the galaxy. Not just because it shattered the balance between soul and machine, not just because it nearly wiped out entire species, but because it broke something fundamental in the warp. Something that no one has been able to fix since. And if that's true, then we're all still living in the fallout. If there's one moment that truly marks the beginning of the war in heaven, not just politically, but on a metaphysical, cosmic level, it's the awakening of the C'tan and the birth of the Necrons. This wasn't just a change in military strength or a shift in technology. This was a fundamental rewriting of what war even meant in the galaxy. The Old Ones and the Necrontyr had already been circling each other with hostility, but once the C'tan entered the scene, everything escalated into something apocalyptic. Before the C'tan were named and worshipped as gods, they were formless consciousnesses, star-born entities that barely interacted with the material universe. The Necrontyr, in their desperation and brilliance, gave these beings shape. They created bodies of necrodermis, and in doing so, gave the C'tan physical form for the first time. And in that moment, they unleashed one of the most horrifying forces the galaxy has ever known. The relationship between the Necrontyr and the C'tan wasn't a partnership, it was predation dressed up as salvation. The C'tan didn't just accept the Necrontyr's offering, they consumed them, first spiritually, then literally. Millions of souls burned away to feed these star gods, and those that remained were forcibly reshaped into soulless machines. The Necrons were born not in glory, but in the cold fire of annihilation. And here's where things take a turn into the metaphysical. The C'tan, unlike the Old Ones, had no connection to the warp. They were anti-psychic, fundamentally opposed to the energies of the immaterium. Their very presence distorted or suppressed psychic activity, which made them uniquely dangerous to the Old Ones, who relied heavily on psionic manipulation and warp travel. It's almost poetic in a twisted way. A war between gods of the soul and gods of the void, between creation and consumption. Once the Necrons were fully converted and the C'tan began to move as gods among their new worshippers, the galaxy changed forever. The Old Ones, once untouchable masters of reality, were suddenly on the defensive. Their psionic networks, their creations, their carefully maintained ecological systems, all began to fall apart under the relentless assault of star-forged weapons and soulless warriors. The thing that strikes me the most when reading through the fan discussions is just how brutal this conflict must have felt to those caught in the middle. We often think of the war in heaven as this mythic clash between titans, but it was also the slow extermination of countless smaller species, many of which had been created by the Old Ones themselves. Every time a world fell, it wasn't just a physical loss, it was a psychic scream, millions of souls torn from the materium, flooding the warp with agony, over and over again. And here's where the damage really starts to spread. You've got the C'tan, beings that literally eat souls, sweeping across the galaxy. You've got the Necrons, beings who no longer register in the warp, acting like voids in reality wherever they go. And you've got the Old Ones, trying desperately to counter this horror by crafting more psychic species, trying to outnumber and outmatch their enemies with raw psionic force. This arms race didn't just escalate the war, it tore at the fabric of the warp itself. The more psychic entities were born, the more their emotions, their pain, their fear bled into the immaterium. And since the warp is shaped by emotion and thought, it began to twist, to roil, to react. What had once been a tool of travel and communication started to lash out, storming and shifting with every planetary genocide. Some say this is when the first true warp storms began, echoes of psychic annihilation, locked in an endless loop. There's a fascinating theory I came across once and it stuck with me. The idea that the C'tan, in their hatred of the warp, actually created the very demons they were trying to destroy. That by forcing the Old Ones to overuse psychic energy, they seeded the chaos they feared most. Not intentionally, of course, these weren't creatures of foresight. But through sheer scale of destruction, they may have accidentally birthed the raw, angry feedback that would one day become the demons of chaos. And honestly, That's one of the most chilling ideas in the lore, that even gods can't control the consequences of their war, that something so ancient, so powerful, could still get away from them and spiral into something worse. It's like setting fire to a forest because you're trying to kill one predator and then watching that fire burn the entire continent. So yeah, the war in heaven wasn't just the start of a physical war. It was the beginning of psychic destabilization on a galactic scale. The first screams that would never stop echoing. The first cracks in the mirror of the warp. The Necrons didn't just wage war on the Old Ones, they waged war on the soul of the galaxy. And the soul has never really recovered. This is the part where the story stops being just about war and starts becoming something far more disturbing. The war in heaven wasn't only about massive battles, star gods, or ancient empires clashing across galaxies. It was also the beginning of a deeper, invisible corruption. Not just of the physical universe, but of the psychic one. The immaterium, the warp, was never the same after this. And honestly, that might be the most terrifying part of the whole thing. At the start, the warp was, well, different. Fans often debate how clean it ever truly was, but there's a general agreement that before the war in heaven, the warp wasn't this chaotic storm of daemons and madness. It was more like a mirror, a sea of thought, potential, and raw emotion. It was reactive, not aggressive. It responded to the minds of sentient beings, but it wasn't yet infected by the sheer volume of pain and rage that would come later. Think of it as a calm ocean that rippled occasionally, but remained still and reflective for the most part. Then came the screams, and not just one or two. We're talking about entire planets, civilizations of psychic-sensitive species, being annihilated in moments. Every soul torn from its body left a scar in the warp. Every mass extinction event added another crack. The Old Ones, trying to defend themselves, unleashed psychic weapons that pulsed with fear, desperation, and fury. Their engineered species, often created for war, were essentially living conduits of emotion, amplifying every trauma, every loss, into the psychic medium around them. It's easy to forget that the warp doesn't forget. It absorbs and remembers. So as these acts of genocide piled up, the warp didn't just ripple, it convulsed. It screamed back. This wasn't just a byproduct of war, it became a feedback loop. More pain created more instability, which in turn caused even more suffering. The warp was being poisoned, cell by cell, by pure emotional trauma on a galactic scale. Some of the most heartbreaking fan interpretations imagine this as the warp developing PTSD. I know that sounds strange, anthropomorphizing a transdimensional medium, but it actually fits. What we now call warp storms, eddies of madness, psychic predators, these may have started as reactions, as desperate self-defense. The immaterium, flooded with agony, began to warp inwards. It twisted itself into something feral. And it wasn't just death. That's what really gets to me. It was the quality of the suffering. When a peaceful civilization is burned to ash, it doesn't just die quietly. It weeps into the warp, it begs, it lashes out. All of that emotion pours into the immaterium and sticks there, like tar, like scars. Over time, this built up into a kind of psychic sediment. Layers and layers of unresolved horror. Some fans even speculate that the earliest proto-demons were born here. Not from chaos gods, but from the emotional echoes of the war in heaven. They weren't aligned to Khorne or Slaanesh or anything like that. Those entities didn't even exist yet. But there may have been other, older creatures. Primitive, demonic predators, spawned from the raw grief of 1 million extinct species. Things that didn't survive into the modern age, but may have left behind the template for what would come later. Another theory, which I find both beautiful and horrifying, suggests that the first truly sentient warp entities weren't daemons at all, but ghosts. Echoes of those who died so violently that their souls refused to fade. Not malevolent at first, but over eons, as the warp itself twisted. Even these remnants were corrupted, infected by the pain around them. They became bitter, hungry, lost, and in time, monstrous. The idea that the warp was forever changed by emotion, not logic or science, makes it feel deeply tragic. It's not just a dangerous place, it's a wounded one. The war in heaven didn't just break the galaxy physically, it emotionally shattered the warp, and it never truly recovered. Every time a psyker today loses control and explodes in a storm of warp energy, it's like a distant echo of that ancient psychic detonation. Every daemon whispering in the dark might be a descendant of the pain seeded millions of years ago. It's also important to understand that the C'tan played their own role here, even if they hated the warp. Their actions forced the Old Ones to use the warp more recklessly, to weaponize their psychic creations. It's this tragic irony. By trying to snuff out the psychic, the C'tan may have actually made the warp stronger in all the worst ways. Not more harmonious, but more violent, more volatile, and ultimately, more terrifying. In the end, we're left with this disturbing possibility that the warp as we know it today, chaotic, predatory, and endlessly hungry, isn't natural. It's a scar, a long, festering wound left by a war fought so long ago that most civilizations don't even remember it. But the warp does. It remembers everything. What really breaks my heart about the war in heaven is what happened to the Old Ones. Not just their fall, but the way their desperate attempts to save the galaxy may have done more harm than good. They weren't just cold scientists or galactic overlords. At least in part, they were trying to protect life. Or, if you're a bit more cynical, preserve their own legacy by preserving the sentient species they had seeded across the stars. But whatever their motivations, it's clear they weren't ready for the scale of destruction that came with the rise of the C'tan and the soulless Necron legions. See, the Old Ones weren't warriors. They didn't build legions of tanks or fleets of warships. They wielded the warp. That was their gift and their weapon. They created intelligent life across countless systems, life that was not only biologically tailored but also psychically attuned. Their creations weren't just soldiers. They were tools of thought, of emotion, of raw warp energy made flesh. Some fans describe the Old Ones as artists painting with souls, and it's kind of a beautiful thought, until you realize what happens when the canvas starts to burn. When the Necrons began their extermination campaigns, entire species that the Old Ones had nurtured for millennia were snuffed out in days. Imagine raising a child to adulthood only to watch them be torn apart in front of you, over and over again, on a galactic scale. That's what the Old Ones were facing, and in their panic, they made a choice that would ripple through history. They began creating more psychic species, faster, stronger, and more attuned to the immaterium than ever before. This is where things really spiral. Because the warp was already destabilizing from all the emotional trauma pouring into it, and now the Old Ones were throwing even more psychic energy into the fire. Entire races were birthed just to be living psychic weapons, races like the Krork, who would later devolve into the Orcs, or others who vanished into myth. These weren't carefully balanced creations like in the Old Ones' golden age. These were emergency measures, and that desperation bled into the results. There's a theory I've always found fascinating, that the Old Ones, for all their brilliance, fundamentally misunderstood the warp. They saw it as a tool, something to be harnessed and manipulated like gravity or electromagnetism. But the truth is, the warp feels, it reacts, and when you start pouring waves of war, terror, and fury into it, it doesn't stay passive, it mutates, it remembers. Some fans go as far as to say that the Old Ones accidentally taught the warp how to be hostile by flooding it with hostile minds, and even their successes were poisoned. The psychic species they created became time bombs. Some of them couldn't control their powers. Others, like the ancestors of the Eldar, would eventually become so psychically sensitive that their emotions alone would reshape reality, and not always for the better. Every new species was a gamble. Every success came at the cost of more instability in the warp. It's one of those tragic ironies you see so often in Warhammer. The ones trying to save the galaxy may have done more to doom it than their enemies ever could. Not because they were evil, but because they were desperate. The Old Ones were cornered, bleeding, and watching their grand design crumble. In that kind of moment, even the wisest make mistakes. And let's not ignore the emotional weight of all this. The Old Ones weren't machines. They had to feel the consequences of their failures, the deaths of their creations, the unraveling of the psychic web they'd spent so long building. There's this fan interpretation I love, sad but poetic, that some Old Ones didn't die in battle, but simply left, retreating into dimensions beyond our understanding, unable to bear the screams echoing through the warp. I mean, imagine it. You've built a galaxy full of life, full of voices, full of potential, And now all you hear is the sound of those voices dying, over and over again. Some fans suggest that this constant cacophony of loss might be what first began to shape the warp into something darker, something more predatory. Not a conscious choice, but an emotional resonance, a response to extinction on a scale too large for even gods to comprehend. The worst part? There was no way to undo it. Once the warp had begun to twist, once these psychic energies were unleashed and anchored into the immaterium, there was no reverse button. The Old Ones could only keep trying. More species, more power, more risk. And the Necrons kept killing. The sediment kept feeding. The warp kept breaking. In hindsight, it feels like a slow-motion apocalypse, a feedback loop of good intentions and catastrophic consequences. The Old Ones wanted to save life, and in doing so, flooded the warp with the very energies that would one day give birth to chaos itself. Maybe they knew, maybe they didn't. But either way, the scars they left behind are still bleeding into the present. And we're all still living with the fallout. When you start talking about the Eldar, you're not just talking about another Xenos race with fancy tech and elegant aesthetics. You're talking about the psychic children of the war in heaven, the direct genetic and spiritual aftermath of a war that shattered the galaxy and broke the warp. And that's not just poetic fan talk. It's baked into who the Eldar are. They didn't just emerge after the war, they are the war's legacy, sculpted from trauma, woven with psychic intensity, and cursed with the burden of perfection. There's this idea, popular among fans, that the Eldar weren't just created, they were designed to carry the psychic weight that the Old Ones could no longer bear. Like biological buffers meant to stabilize the warp through harmony and mental clarity. And in the beginning, it kind of worked. The early Eldar were a marvel. Their psychic potential was unmatched, their connection to the warp so fluid and precise that they could reshape matter, travel without machines, and even manipulate emotion itself. It's easy to forget that at their height, they weren't just powerful, they were sublime. But that kind of power doesn't come without a price. See, when you're born into a galaxy that's already scarred by unimaginable pain, and when your soul is so sensitive that even a stray thought can leave ripples in the warp, then you're basically living with a constant echo of past trauma. And the Eldar didn't just inherit psychic talent, they inherited psychic wounds. Some believe that every Eldar soul carries echoes of the war in heaven, like a kind of ancestral grief. Not literal memories, but emotional imprints, raw instincts forged in a time when reality itself was screaming. And maybe that's why their culture has always walked such a fine line between brilliance and collapse. Their psychic sensitivity isn't just a gift, it's a curse. Every joy they feel is ecstasy. Every sorrow is despair. And in a galaxy where the warp amplifies every emotion, that kind of volatility is a loaded gun. This might explain the core tragedy of the Eldar as a race. Their fall, culminating in the birth of Slaanesh, wasn't just about decadence or boredom. It was about a species trying to fill a hole in their souls that they didn't even understand. A hunger for emotional extremes that may have started long before the fall, rooted in the very way they were made. Fans often compare it to inherited trauma. They didn't choose to be like this. They were shaped by a war they didn't fight, but one that lives on inside them. And the signs are everywhere. The Craftworld Eldar now cling to strict path systems just to survive. They have to regulate their emotions like a pressure valve. Because even a moment of uncontrolled feeling can be enough to draw the attention of daemons. That's not normal. That's not how a species naturally evolves. That's damage control. That's what you do when you've been built on top of a psychic fault line that could go off at any time. Even the Drukhari, twisted as they are, reflect this inheritance. They abandon the psychic arts not because they lack talent, but because they fear what's waiting for them on the other side. They feed on pain because it's the only way they've found to keep their souls from being swallowed whole. Again, not a natural cultural evolution, a survival mechanism born from cosmic PTSD. And then there are the Harlequins and the Inari, both movements trying, in their own strange ways, to reclaim or redirect the psychic legacy of their people, whether it's through mythic performance or desperate gambits to resurrect fallen gods. They're all responses to a truth that no Eldar can escape. They are the echo of something broken. and they've been trying to rewrite that echo ever since. One theory I love suggests that the Eldar aren't just carrying the warp's scars, they're slowly becoming part of the warp itself. That their souls are so vibrant, so defined, that over time they're blurring the lines between reality and the immaterium. This would explain why Eldar spirits linger so strongly in the warp, why their deaths resonate so profoundly, and why they fear soul death more than any other race in the galaxy. When they die, they don't just vanish, they become part of the wound. It's also worth noting that the Eldar have always had a kind of tragic clairvoyance. Farseers, bonesingers, spirit seers, these are people who don't just tap into the warp, they see the future, touch memory, weave fate. And maybe that's not a bonus. Maybe it's a side effect of being so tightly bound to a realm that's been weeping since the war in heaven. They see the future because they're walking through the past every time they close their eyes. In the end, I think that makes the Eldar so compelling and so devastating. They're not just survivors, they're reminders. Living monuments to a war most of the galaxy has forgotten, but that still echoes in every warp storm, every demonic whisper, every soul scream. They didn't start the fire, but it burns through them all the same. And no matter how far they run, no matter how disciplined or twisted they become, they'll always be children of the storm. One of the most haunting questions that keeps circling in fan circles is this: was the warp ever truly pure? Was there a time before the war in heaven when the immaterium was something closer to serene? Not harmless maybe, but untouched by the filth, fury, and parasitic hunger that defines it now. It's hard to imagine, especially for anyone who's grown up in the lore of Warhammer, where the warp is almost synonymous with horror. But if we go back far enough, peel away the layers of blood and shadow, maybe, just maybe, it wasn't always like this. The theory that the warp was once calm, more like a sea of potential than a storm of rage, isn't just wishful thinking. There are hints in the oldest stories, scattered fragments in Xeno's myth, and even some Eldar texts that suggest the warp was once a place of pure possibility. A realm of raw thought and emotion, yes, but one that resonated with intention and clarity, not madness, like a musical instrument that hadn't yet been dropped off a cliff and set on fire. Fans love to speculate that the Old Ones could only have done what they did, crafting life, manipulating space-time, using the warp as a tool, if it was in a more stable or at least predictable state. The idea that you could navigate it, live in harmony with it, even construct psychic networks between worlds, sounds laughable now. But back then, that was the standard. Warp gates weren't death traps. Psychic energy wasn't a one-way ticket to daemonhood, it was just energy. Wild? Yes, but not yet poisoned. Then came the war in heaven, and everything changed, and I mean everything. The psychic pressure that built during that war wasn't a short burst, it was sustained. For millions of years, the warp was being fed a constant stream of anguish, fear, hatred, and grief. And that doesn't just pass through, it lingers, it molds. It reshapes the warp's very substance. That's the horrifying part. This wasn't just noise. It was reprogramming. There's a comparison that stuck with me from one fan forum. It likened the warp to a sponge. The more it absorbs, the heavier and more saturated it becomes. During the war in heaven, the sponge didn't just soak up pain, it became saturated to the point of leaking. And what leaked out? That was the beginning of corruption. The raw emotions of countless dead and dying minds didn't just echo, they congealed. They became the earliest building blocks of what would later become daemons, warp entities, and eventually chaos itself. Some fans argue that the warp after the war in heaven essentially gained sentience, or at least the seeds of it. Not in the form of a single mind, but a kind of collective psychic ecosystem, fed by the worst of sentient experience. And just like an ecosystem out of balance, it grew sick. Where once the warp might have amplified love, creativity, even peace, now it had been rewired to favor violence, obsession, and despair. Those were the loudest voices now, and the warp listens to volume. This idea that the warp became something fundamentally different after the war is more than just academic. It explains why psychic travel became so dangerous, why navigators are needed, why the Astronomicon is even necessary. In a pre-war warp, such tools might have been overkill. But in a post-war warp, they're the only way to survive the journey. Reality and unreality don't flow together anymore. They grind against each other like rusted gears. And then there's the most disturbing possibility, that this transformation is irreversible. That the warp was changed at a structural level, not just stained but mutated. Some fans believe that if you were somehow able to wipe out all emotion in the galaxy, silence every soul, kill every psyker, shut down every thought, you still wouldn't fix it. The scars are too deep. The warp has adapted to trauma. It feeds on it now. Even in moments of galactic calm, it still stirs restlessly, hungry for echoes. That brings us to why this matters for the galaxy now, in the grimdark present of the 41st millennium. Because every single psychic act, every warp jump, every flicker of emotion, especially fear, rage, and grief, feeds that wound. It's like the galaxy is trapped in a feedback loop it can't escape. The more it tries to fight its nightmares, the more power those nightmares gain. And worst of all, no one's even trying to fix it. The Imperium doesn't want to understand the warp. They want to cage it, dominate it, or wall it off. The Eldar are too fractured. The Necrons hate it and want it dead. And chaos? Well, it's their playground now. They've become the children of the storm, feeding off what the war in heaven left behind. What started as a psychic scar is now a living, writhing ecosystem of despair. And it's not going anywhere. So yeah, when people ask, is the warp still haunted by the war in heaven? I always want to say, it's not haunted. It is the ghost. Every storm, every daemon, every psyker that loses their mind, that's not some random occurrence. That's the echo of a war so ancient that only the warp still remembers it clearly. And unfortunately for all of us, the warp never forgets. There's something uniquely unsettling about the idea that the war in heaven might not be finished. That after tens of millions of years, we're still seeing ripples, not just metaphorically, but literally. Because the galaxy of the 41st millennium isn't just grim and dark, it's haunted. And not just by daemons or heresy, but by ancient wounds that never closed. You start digging into the strange anomalies cropping up across space, and suddenly it doesn't feel like the past is behind us. It feels like it's waking up. One of the clearest signs is the warp itself. We all know it's a nightmare, but sometimes it acts different. Not just chaotic, but specific. There are zones, whole regions of space where psykers port the same visions, the same emotional patterns. Places where the warp doesn't just rage but seems to mourn, or scream, or whisper. These aren't ordinary disturbances. They don't behave like the random madness we expect from the immaterium. They follow a rhythm, they pulse. And it's in those moments you start to wonder, is the warp replaying something? Remembering something? Is it echoing the screams of a species that died long before mankind ever dreamed of stars? Take the screaming tides near the ghoul stars. There have been reports from astropaths and navigators who swear they hear voices, old voices, chanting in languages no lexicanic can identify. Some believe they're psychic ghosts from a pre-human age, maybe even echoes of the old ones themselves. Others think these are the final death cries of extinct species, looped in the warp like broken recordings. Either way, it's not random, it's patterned, intentional, which is far more terrifying. Then you've got the Blackstone fortresses. Ancient constructs, older than the Imperium, armed with weapons designed specifically to disrupt warp entities. We now know many of these were tied to the Old Ones and possibly the Necrons. But what's really disturbing is that some of these fortresses are reactivating. Slowly, silently, their systems humming to life in dark space. Not all of them are under Necron control. Some of them respond to nothing we can identify. It's like they're waiting for something, or someone. And speaking of waiting, let's talk about the Citan. The Star Gods, the Devourers of Souls. Most of them were shattered by the Necrons long ago, broken into shards and imprisoned. But those prisons are failing. We've already seen multiple Citan shards freed in recent centuries, acting with terrifying autonomy. They're still not at full power, sure, but they're thinking, plotting, learning. Every time a shard reawakens, you can feel the galaxy hold its breath. Because if even one of them manages to reclaim its full form, it could reignite the horrors of the war in heaven on a scale the Imperium isn't remotely ready for. There are theories among fan circles that the awakening of the Citan isn't just random, that the increase in psychic instability, the surging of warp storms, even the rise of the Great Rift, all of it is stirring something buried deep in reality. a call and response. The warp screams, and something ancient stirs in reply. Maybe the shards hear it. Maybe they remember it. Some believe the warp is essentially crying out for closure to a war that never truly ended, and the Xetan are listening. And it's not just in space. On the surface of worlds long forgotten, Archeoxeno expeditions have found ruins that defy explanation, monoliths that bleed psychic pressure, tombs where the air itself pulses with hate. There are reports of psychers going mad near these sites, not because of demonic presence, but because of the sheer weight of emotion imprinted on the land. Like the planets themselves remember the war, like they're still carrying the last screams of the dead. There was a case I read about recently, unconfirmed of course, because this is the Imperium and knowledge is a luxury. But supposedly, a black ship never made it back from a routine psyker collection in the Segmentum Obscurus. The ship's last astropathic signal described a tower of living memory rising from the surface of a dead world. No demonic activity, no enemy presence, just this massive obelisk, pulsing with raw psychic emotion, so overwhelming it drowned out Gellar fields. No one ever heard from them again. Even the Eldar feel it. Farseers on multiple craft worlds have reported visions that don't align with current timelines, memories of events they never lived. Entire paths of fate that lead backward, spiraling into an ancient silence filled with flame and sorrow. Some have begun to believe that the psychic echoes of the war in heaven are interfering with prophecy itself. That even time, in its own warped way, is starting to buckle under the pressure of what came before. It's stuff like this that makes me think we haven't seen the last of those scars. That in the grand scheme of galactic history, 40 million years might not be long enough for the warp to truly forget, especially when the galaxy keeps feeding it fresh pain. Maybe these anomalies are just flare-ups, or maybe they're the first groans of something stirring in its sleep. If that's the case, we're in trouble, because the last time the galaxy saw the full wrath of the entities behind those echoes, entire star systems were turned to ash, civilizations disappeared without a trace, and the warp, for the first time, began to hate. So yeah, maybe the war is still going. Not with fleets and armies, but with memories, with screams, with whispers in the dark, and maybe, just maybe, the sleepers are starting to talk again. You know, one of the most fascinating rabbit holes in the Warhammer community is this ongoing debate about the nature of the warp's corruption. Is the Immaterium as broken and dangerous as it is today solely because of the war in heaven? Or was that just the first crack in a mirror that was always going to shatter? It's one of those debates that doesn't really have a clean answer, but the theories, the theories, are incredible. Some are poetic, some horrifying, and a few are honestly pretty mind-blowing. There's a big camp of fans who argue that the war in heaven wasn't just the beginning of warp instability, it was the singular moment that defined what the warp would become. In this interpretation, before the warp was a blank slate, a raw, reactive medium shaped by thought and feeling, but without form or intent. Then the war came, and with it came emotion on a scale the galaxy had never seen: grief, rage, terror, desperation, and despair. These weren't isolated outbursts, they were constant, relentless, generational. The idea here is that the warp didn't just echo those feelings, it absorbed them, and over time those impressions became structural, like grooves etched into the flow of the Immaterium. That's why some fans believe the demons we see today aren't just entities born from chaos gods, they're descendants of archetypes formed during the war in heaven. Maybe not in shape or name, but in purpose. They're emotional echoes that gained enough mass to start thinking for themselves. One popular theory paints the chaos gods not as ancient beings that always existed, but as emergent phenomena born after the war in heaven, once enough psychic trauma had gathered in the warp. Khorne, in this view, wasn't a god of war in the beginning, just a primal scream, a concentrated nod of all the rage and bloodlust unleashed during that first galactic genocide. Over eons, it became self-aware, it learned to feed, it learned to fight back. But not everyone agrees. Another theory argues that the war in heaven was only the first wound, and that the true corruption came later, from the psychic evolution of younger races like humanity and the Eldar. This camp sees the war in heaven as a necessary but not sufficient cause. It cracked the foundation. Sure, but the real collapse came with the psychic explosion of the Eldar Empire and the eventual fall that birthed Slaanesh. According to this view, the warp was damaged, yes, but not yet doomed, until mortal races started pouring their own emotions into the maelstrom. Then there's a more fringe but compelling theory. The warp was never pure to begin with. It always had the potential for horror. It was simply waiting for someone to give it a voice. The war in heaven, in this view, didn't break the warp. It taught it how to express itself. Think of it like a child that had never been spoken to. The war was the first conversation, and unfortunately, it was a conversation of screaming, fire, and betrayal. So now the warp speaks that language. It learned to be a monster. I've also seen some fascinating pseudo-scientific takes that treat the warp like a quantum feedback system. The idea is that psychic energy, once released, doesn't just dissipate. It amplifies through sympathetic resonance. So when enough beings feel grief at the same time, it creates a resonance field in the warp. And if you keep adding to it, it becomes self-sustaining. That's how daemons form. Not from a god snapping its fingers, but from psychic feedback loops hitting critical mass. It's less magic, more emotional thermodynamics. Completely speculative, of course, but weirdly elegant. There's even a theory that suggests the war in heaven had to happen to give birth to chaos, that the universe was somehow incomplete without it. In this cosmic horror take, the warp was always meant to become conscious, and the war in heaven was the ignition event. Not an accident, but a necessary evolution. The galaxy needed a dark mirror, and now, well, we've got one. The most heartbreaking take I've come across is the idea that the warp remembers better than anyone else. That it's not just haunted, it is the memory. Every act of love, cruelty, sacrifice, or genocide gets written into its flesh. And the war in heaven left entire volumes. So every time a psyker touches the warp, they're brushing up against that ancient pain. Maybe they don't know it. Maybe they feel it as pressure, as fear, as madness. But deep down, they're touching a psychic record of a time when the galaxy was torn apart by hatred and godlike arrogance. And it never lets them forget. In the end, no theory really explains everything. That's part of what makes this setting so rich. You're dealing with metaphysical trauma on a cosmic scale. And no one, not the Imperium, not the Eldar, not even the daemons themselves, has a complete picture. But one thing feels certain. The war in heaven changed the warp. Maybe not entirely. Maybe not alone. But it left a wound so deep that even now, the galaxy still bleeds through it. If the ancient scars left by the war in heaven are still alive, still echoing through the warp and across reality, then the next terrifying question is, who might try to use them? Because in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, one thing is always true. Nothing stays buried. Every forgotten ruin, every psychic echo, every cursed memory becomes a weapon the moment someone figures out how to point it in the right direction. And in this galaxy, there's no shortage of factions who would kill, burn, or twist entire star systems just to gain an edge. So what happens when they start digging into the oldest wounds of all? Let's start with the Imperium. On paper, they shouldn't even be capable of investigating this kind of thing. The Mechanicus is obsessed with ritual over reason. The Inquisition is more likely to burn knowledge than study it, and the Ecclesiarchy treats ancient psychic scars like blasphemous echoes of forbidden gods. But beneath that dogmatic surface, there's always a few who look deeper. Certain inquisitors, especially from the Ordo Xenos or Malleus, have made it their mission to uncover the forgotten truths of the galaxy, no matter how dangerous. There are whispers of research stations positioned near long-dead psychic anomalies, entire death worlds quarantined not for what lives on the surface, but for what screams underneath it. Some fans theorize that parts of the Imperium already do use the ancient scars. The black ships, for instance, might not just be collecting psychers for sacrifice. Maybe they're using them to map the deep emotional currents of the warp, tracing old patterns, trying to predict or manipulate warp behavior. It's the kind of terrifying bureaucratic exploitation only the Imperium could pull off. They're not trying to heal the wound. They're just weaponizing the pus. Then there's chaos. This one is almost obvious. If the scars of the war in heaven fuel the instability of the warp, then the chaos gods are already feeding on them. But what's worse is that they might also understand them. We like to think of daemons as rage-driven, instinctive predators, but what if some of them remember? What if the most ancient warp entities were born during the War in Heaven and still carry fragments of knowledge from that time? Maybe some of the greater daemons don't just spread chaos, they guide it, steering mortal cults toward ancient scars like vultures circling a battlefield from 10,000 years ago. There's even a fan theory that some of the more powerful chaos cults are actively trying to reignite the energies of the War in Heaven. Not just for worship, but because those psychic wounds are pure. They're old, they're foundational. Tapping into them might allow them to bypass the convoluted mechanisms of modern demonic summoning and pull something truly ancient into real space. Not a demon, not even a god, but something older. Something broken and angry and half-remembered. Something that still thinks it's fighting the old ones. But if we're talking about tapping into ancient power, we have to talk about the Necrons. Of all the factions in the galaxy, they're the ones most intimately tied to the War in Heaven. And they know it. Their technology is layered with forgotten protocols, warp-nullifying architecture, and hidden functions that even modern-day Necron lords don't fully understand. Some fans believe the Necrons have always been aware of the scars left in the warp. That their silent crusade isn't just about purging chaos, it's about sealing the wound, cauterizing the warp, and erasing all psychic influence from the galaxy. Imagine a tomb world that awakens to find a warp scar pulsing nearby. The Necrons don't study it. They bury it in black stone, trap it in null fields, and cut it off from real space entirely. Not out of fear, but out of hatred. They remember what the warp did, and if they can, they'll make sure it never whispers again. There's even speculation that some Necron dynasties have begun to experiment with psychic counter-resonance technology, devices meant to actively collapse warp echoes and suppress emotional feedback loops. Think of it like anti-soul tech. The idea that they might one day turn these ancient scars into battlegrounds for a war of annihilation is chilling. Because the Necrons don't want to harness the warp, they want to erase it. But then you've got the wildcard factions. The Eldar, especially the Ynnari, might be trying to use these scars in a different way. Not to destroy or feed, but to understand. There's a hope among some Craftworld scholars that maybe, just maybe, these scars could be healed. That by understanding the psychic damage done in the War in Heaven, they could find a way to stabilize their souls, or even slow the decay of the warp itself. Maybe even quiet the voices of the dead. Or the Leagues of Votann with their ancient data repositories. What do they know? If even a fraction of their STC cores contain memories of pre-fall history, they might have records of warp behavior before the corruption. Maybe they're sitting on secrets the rest of the galaxy has forgotten. Maybe they already have predictive models for warp turbulence based on ancient emotional resonance patterns. Who knows what they're hiding in those databanks? And finally, there's us, humanity. Not just the Imperium as a machine, but individual psychers, rogue scholars, radical inquisitors, tech heresy cults. There are always people poking at the edges of what shouldn't be touched. People who hear the whispers in the warp and don't flinch, but listen. What if someone cracks the code? What if someone figures out how to trace those ancient echoes and follow them back to their source? Not to silence them, but to rewrite them. Because that's the scariest theory of all, that the scars aren't just marks, they're instructions, imprints, memory patterns so old and powerful they can be reactivated. And the moment someone taps the right frequency, the War in Heaven doesn't just echo again, it restarts. And if that happens, the galaxy won't be ready. Not this time. So, are the scars of the War in Heaven still active? Or are we just projecting our fears onto ancient myths, reading too much into every warp storm and psychic scream? That's the hard part, isn't it? The line between historical trauma and present danger is so blurred in the 41st millennium that sometimes even the most rational minds can't tell where myth ends and reality begins. But the more you look at the galaxy, the patterns, the anomalies, the unnatural rhythms of the warp, the harder it is to believe this is all coincidence. Let's not pretend we have definitive proof. The Imperium's archives are incomplete, fragmented by war, censorship, and religious paranoia. The Eldar's own myths are half lost to time, scattered across crumbling craft worlds and distorted by their own psychic trauma. Even the Necrons, who were actually there, have spent so many eons in stasis that some of their dynasties barely remember who they are, let alone what truly happened during the war in heaven. But there's a shape to the silence, a pattern to the chaos. And when so many factions, mortal and immortal alike, begin to circle the same ruins, the same echoes, the same ancient voids, it doesn't feel like delusion anymore. It feels like something stirring. Some fans argue that all of this is a kind of cosmic paridolia, that we're seeing faces in the storm because we want to, because the idea of the warp being broken by an ancient war gives us a story, a reason. It turns senseless horror into consequence. That's a powerful lens, and I get it. But even if it's just myth, even if the scars are metaphor, the effects are real. The warp behaves like a wounded thing. That's not fan fiction. That's just observation. And if you treat it like a living thing, it starts to make a terrible kind of sense. What really makes me believe there's something there, something real, is how the warp remembers. You look at how psychic echoes persist across millennia, how places and people carry impressions of events long past, and it becomes clear that time doesn't move normally in the immaterium. Everything is now. Everything is memory. Everything is potential. In a place like that, how could the screams of a war that ended tens of millions of years ago ever truly fade? And then there's the question of agency. If the warp is still shaped by that ancient trauma, then what does that mean for those who live inside it? Or worse, those who use it? Are we navigating through an ocean or through a haunted house with walls that bleed memory? Every psyker who touches the warp might be brushing up against a shard of something older, something primal, something that never finished dying. If that's true, then every act of psychic will is an act of archaeology. We're not just channeling power, we're waking it up. That brings us to one of the most disturbing but also most fascinating theories out there, that the war in heaven isn't over. Not really. Not in the way wars end. Maybe the last gun fell silent. Maybe the last Cetan shard was shattered. But in the warp, in the place where thought and emotion have mass and memory, that war might still be going on. A slow, grinding echo war, playing out in spirit instead of flesh. And every act of suffering, every burst of fear or anger or hatred might be fuel for the next volley. In the end, maybe it doesn't matter whether the scars are literally still open or just spiritually resonant. What matters is that they still shape behavior, still distort the warp, still haunt the galaxy. That's their power. Not in being active battlefields, but in being unhealed, in how they set the tone for everything that came after. The fall of the Eldar, the rise of chaos, the corruption of mankind's soul. They're not causes exactly, but they're seeds. And those seeds are still growing, which means this story isn't ancient history. It's not a cold case. It's a slow-motion detonation, still unfolding across time. And we're all standing in the blast radius. If you've made it this far, thank you for diving with me into one of the most haunting mysteries of the Warhammer universe. The war in heaven is more than just a background event. It might be the root of everything we fear in the 41st millennium. If you want to explore more forgotten horrors, long-lost truths, and dangerous theories, make sure to hit that subscribe button, like the video, and let me know in the comments. Do you think the warp still remembers? Because I think it never forgot. There's one angle to this whole discussion that always gives me chills. And it's not about who caused the scars or how deep they run, but about what those scars might become. Not just echoes or memories, not even tools for factions to exploit, but actual entities. Living, thinking presences born entirely from the emotional sediment left by the war in heaven. I'm not talking about daemons in the traditional sense. I'm talking about something older, something that isn't chaos, but pre-chaos. A different kind of warp life, alien, ancient, and quietly watching from the edges of the immaterium. Some fans call them proto-demons, others, the firstborn of pain. They're theoretical, of course. We don't have hard lore to confirm their existence, but the idea keeps popping up in discussions, especially in communities that obsess over lost warp phenomena. The theory goes like this. Before Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, or Slaanesh ever coalesced into full godhood, there were raw impressions, fragments of emotion so powerful they began to persist on their own. Not sentient in the way we understand it, but conscious adjacent, like a storm that's learned to circle a city over and over again because it remembers being angry there. These proto-entities, if they exist, would be the deepest scars of the war in heaven. Not daemons spawned by chaos, but precursors to what demons became. Emotional fossils layered into the warp like bones buried under centuries of dust. And if they're still down there, buried under the newer, louder screams of modern suffering, what would it take to dig them up? Or worse, what if they're slowly digging themselves out? Some fans argue that certain warp anomalies already are these entities trying to surface. Regions of space where the warp behaves with terrifying consistency, not like random madness, but like an ancient ritual playing out again and again. There's that one region near the Maelstrom, where entire worlds have reported the same dream at the same time. Images of a burning silver sky, a black sun that bleeds light, and voices speaking in reverse. No known daemon matches this pattern. No chaos god claims it. So what is it? Some say it's a scar trying to become a voice. There's also talk about the Emperor. Of course there is. There always is. Some believe he knows about these proto-entities, that part of the Golden Throne's hidden function isn't just to guide the Astronomicon, but to keep something locked down, to prevent some ancient echo from reaching critical mass and rising into full awareness. The theory gets even darker when you consider that the Emperor might not have created the throne for travel at all, but as a seal. A psychic cork jammed into the deepest wound the galaxy ever suffered. If that's true, then every time his power flickers, we're not just risking navigational collapse. We're risking something older than chaos getting its first breath. Another weird but fascinating take is that the Necrons didn't just break the Cetan, they buried parts of their essence in the warp. Not by choice, but as a side effect of shattering star gods whose very presence distorted physics. If even a fragment of a Cetan bled into the immaterium during that process, it might have curdled into one of these proto-beings. Not a soul, not a god, but a kind of shadow thought, a memory so violent and so focused that it grew hooks and teeth just to keep itself from fading. There's even a speculative link to the Hood. Yeah, I know, everyone forgets about the Hood. But some fan theories suggest their peculiar relationship with time and entropy might not just be biological. It might be psychic. That they're drawn to areas where these ancient warp scars are most potent, feeding off the emotional radiation like spiritual carrion eaters. In that view, the Hood aren't just scavengers. They're instinctively migrating toward the oldest pain in the galaxy, maybe even trying to consume it. Or protect us from it. Depends on how generous you're feeling. And that's what makes this idea so captivating. It reframes the warp not as a hellscape of madness, but as a kind of psychic archaeology site. The deeper you dig, the weirder and more primal it gets. You're not just uncovering ancient battles or extinct species, you're uncovering intent, emotions that have calcified into structure, rage that shaped the terrain, fear that etched geography into the warp itself. Imagine traveling through a region of the immaterium shaped entirely by the grief of a species that died before Earth ever cooled. That's not fantasy. That's what psychers already report, in fragments, in fits of madness, and sudden tears. So maybe the warp's deepest scars aren't just wounds. Maybe they're seeds. And just like any seed, they can grow. All it takes is the right conditions, the right emotional resonance, the right mass of psychic energy, the right pattern repeated long enough, and something ancient, something from before the warp was a battlefield, might crawl its way back into being. And we won't be ready for it, because our entire understanding of the warp is built on chaos, on the four gods, on the demons we know. But these things, they're not gods. They're not demons. They're memories that never died. Emotions with roots so deep they might have become organisms, or worse, ecosystems. So yeah, I think the scars of the war in heaven aren't just echoes. I think they're growing. And the galaxy has no idea what's about to wake up beneath its feet. If you've stayed with me through all of this, through ancient wars, broken gods, haunted psychers, and the endless echoes rippling through the warp, thank you. It means you're just as fascinated, and maybe a little disturbed, by the idea that the galaxy we see in Warhammer isn't just shaped by the now, but by traumas so old, they've become part of reality itself. These aren't just background stories or forgotten legends. They're living forces, bleeding into every warped storm, every whispered prophecy, every flicker of psychic flame. This universe is layered in mystery, and for every question we try to answer, a dozen more rise from the shadows. And that's exactly why I love it, and why I keep digging deeper. If you're into this kind of storytelling, this kind of theory crafting, where lore meets emotion and myth turns into danger, then go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Like the video if it kept you thinking. Drop a comment. Tell me your favorite theory, or if you think the war in heaven is still echoing in ways we haven't even begun to understand. Because here, we don't just talk about what happened in Warhammer. We talk about what it means. And trust me, there's still so much more to uncover.